Shir and Avodas Haparsha in the beautiful neighborhood of Shari Chesed, in the wonderful Kehillah of Ner Avram. And we're going to speak this evening based a lot on Moshe Wolfson Zatzal, the Mashgiach of Torah Avodas for decades and the founder of the Kehillah Emunas Yisrael and its many branches. And he ties in Bikurim with Rosh Hashana. Okay, in other words, in Savo, we have the mitzvah of Bikurim. The first fruits, which Chazal describes so poetically, is Adam Yotzei, Sode goes out into his field, V'ra te'eno shebikra. You see a fig that became ripe. Karich gemi, he wraps a little reader, is such around it that it should be identified that that's the first one. And then there's the taking of the Bikurim to Yerushalayim, to the Beis HaMikdash. Really an exceptional type of mitzvah, the tremendous fanfare that there was, the gathering of the people to go in procession to Yerushalayim, and the singing, and when they came to Yerushalayim, so everybody had to stop in the middle of their work and stand up for them and say, Bruchim Aboim, and then you bring it to the Kohen in the Beis HaMikdash, and you tell over the whole thing, Yigarati Hayom L'Hashem Elokecha, right? I thank him for this, that I'm not a kofli tova, I'm not someone who denies or overlooks the good that was done to me. And Rav Wolfson asks a variety of questions about it. One, that's going to tie into what we have, is why do you have to bring it to the Beis HaMikdash? In other words, we have a variety of matnos kahuna, of first things that we have that we give to the Kohen. For example, Reshis Hagez, the first of the shearing of your sheep. Right? There are halachas, is how many sheep you need to have, how much wool you need to have, you give to the Kohen. My son lives in a yeshuv called Malei Levona, and there they have Pinat Chai, a big Pinat Chai, a little zoo with all sorts of animals, and they have quite a few sheep, and they had enough for Veishis Hagez. And we went out there, my father was the Kohen, and he received the Veishis Hagez. Right? So I got that big amount of wool. Somebody's supposed to be making a belt out of it for him or something. So that's there. There's some Bezra L'chaim V'keva, parts of the animals, the shech, there's a variety of things. And those are given to the Kohen wherever the Kohen is. You don't go to the Beis HaMikdash to give it to the Kohen. Why here do we take these first fruits and dafka go to the Beis HaMikdash? And it's emphasized that as part of what you say when you bring the Bikurim, what's called the Mikra Bikurim, these psukim that a person says over, he says, Vayivi'enu ala makom hazeh, and Hashem brought us to this place. Rashi says, not just that he brought us to Eretz Yisrael in the story, HaMakom hazeh, meaning the Beis HaMikdash, where I'm standing right now. So why? What is in the Beis HaMikdash that makes it unique? What is it about the location of the Beis HaMikdash? In the Beis HaMikdash is the Evan Shesiyah, the foundation stone, if you want to call it, the point of the beginning of the creation of the world, right? That's why I think it's the Chasam Sofer explains when you see it says Eretz Yisrael Gvoa Mikol Ha'arotzos. Eretz Yisrael is higher than all lands, right? People start talking mathematical things, etc. He says, if you have this ball and this is the point of starting, that's viewed as the highest point in it. That's where it is. So you have the beginning in terms of makom, in terms of place, is there. The fruit that you're bringing there is the first fruit of the year, also the beginning. And we'll have to see how that ties in to the idea of Rosh Hashana as well. Okay, so let's try to take a look. He asked now a fascinating question about Rosh Hashana. The Torah tells us, Shalosh Pamim Bashana, Yeroya Kol Zechorcha Espnei Adam Hashem Elokecha B'Makom Asher Yivchar, Aliyah L'Regel. 3 Regalim Am Yisrael have a mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel to go up to the Beis HaMikdash. Why not for Rosh Hashana? Why not? You think that's the king's palace. If Rosh Hashana were Mamlich the king, go to the king's palace. No, you don't have to. Stay at home, make your shul. You can do these things. So he explains like this. He says it's famous that the Baal HaTanya said his explanation that in Elul HaMelech Basadeh, and Elul, the king, is in the field, meaning easily approachable. On Rosh Hashanah, HaMelech Ba'armon, the king is in his castle. But, explains Rav Wolfson, that what happens is that the king's castle extends to everywhere that we are. Meaning, Rosh Hashanah is about, as we say in the davening, Melech al kol ha'aretz. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Melech over everything. So in other words, in reality, his palace can and does and can extend to everywhere we are. And this is the first explanation I saw for the minig, at least among Ashkenazim, of the Chazan for Shachris, starting HaMelech in his place and not at the Amud. Right? In other words, if you pay attention to this, whoever's going to be Chazan, he has a seat over there. So he starts, right, when it's time for him to start, HaMelech, and then he goes walking over to the Amud to continue. Right? Why? He says to show the idea that the Melech is where you are on Rosh Hashanah. That Hashem's Malchus comes and is here with you. He explains that's why. So it's as if the Beis HaMikdash comes to us where we are. That's why we have Hishtachava. The only time that we bow down, right, entirely on the floor, full out, what's called Hishtachava, is on Rosh Hashanah, a little bit, and much more on Yom Kippur. He says that is because that's where we are. And it fits in with what Chazal said, the Aser Simei Tshuva, Dirshu Hashem Bihi Motzo. Seek out Hashem when he is found, or he makes himself found grammatically. Meaning he makes himself close to you, makes himself available to you. So all these things mean that you have the aspect of the Beis HaMikdash right there, which means at the beginning of time, Rosh Hashanah, which was the day of creation of Adam, the very beginning of that whole history. And we have a connection then to the place of that beginning of the world, which is the Even Shia. And that's also the place that we bring the Bikurim, those things, those fruits that are new. Now he brings just an interesting gematria from the Imrei Noam. Rabbi Jikov, he said that Rosh Hashanah equals Beis HaMikdash. Okay? Rosh Hashanah equals Beis HaMikdash. I always take gematrias on faith. I never do it, but I'm sure it must work out somehow. And now what happened? On Rosh Hashanah, there's the Psikta goes through all the events of Rosh Hashanah. It all happened on Rosh Hashanah. Everything we see with Adam Arishon there, he was created, he was formed. He did the Chet. He ate from the Eitz Hadas on Rosh Hashanah, and the Din was on Rosh Hashanah. So therefore, Adam Arishon damaged the Bria, and the damage was expressed as Hevi Misa La'olam. He brought death into the world. Now, in our minds, we always think that just means, okay, a man was supposed to be immortal, and now he's going to die. But Misa is something much more prevalent among us in all ways. Misa is a process, right? There's this depressing statement that from the moment you're born, you're dying of old age, which means that things as they go on in time get weaker, right? Get less enthusiastic, less full of life, less strong. That's the idea of something getting old. Now, I'll point out that this does not necessarily have to relate to the age of your physical body. Nachman of Breslov talks about something called Zikna de Sitra Achra, the old age of the Sitra Achra. That means, he says, if a person could be 20 years old, but if he's not willing to change, he's not willing to refresh, to renew, that's what he calls an old man. A person could be 100 years old in his goof, but if he's ready to do something new and look at things new and re-examine things, that person's young. I saw once, I think, a letter to the Chazon Ish. Please. Ruach Tzir, right? A young spirit. The Chazon Ish, I saw in a letter once, I think he said that if there was a mitzvah that I was doing in a certain way all my life, and then through my learning or learning with someone, I discovered that it should be done differently, he said, I'll immediately do it differently. That's the idea of young, right? That it doesn't get there. And we feel it oftentimes. Everything gets old. Excitement at the beginning of marriage, it gets old. Excitement when you get a new possession, it gets old, right? The feeling of it, all those things go, all of that is from this Chet of Adam Harishon. So the Beis HaMikdash is an exception to this. Because if you remember, the creation preceded the Chet Adam Harishon. And that Evan Shia, that place of the beginning, that was all before that. Therefore, the Beis Hamikdash remains as a place of newness and freshness that doesn't get old. Where do we see it? Number one, the famous pasuk, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbos, Shesulim Beveis Hashem, those who are planted in the house of Hashem, B'chatzos Elokeinu Yafrichu, in the courtyards of our God, they will flower. Od Yunuvun B'Seva, they will continue on, right, to be growing and producing in their old age. T'shenim v'ra'nanim yiyu, they'll be fresh, right, and full of life and vibrancy. That's talking about the Beis Hamikdash. B'chatzos Elokeinu Yafrichu, right? And the lechem apanim, it was known, right? That bread was brought to the Beis Hamikdash. It would be eaten by the Kohanim after 7 days, and it was described as cham kiyom hilokcha. It was fresh as when it was baked. It would never get stale. And Yaakov Avinu said, right, Ein zekim beis Elokim, where I slept now, this is the house of Hashem, v'anochi lo yodati. Rashi says, if I knew, I wouldn't have slept here. Why? Because sleeping also has an aspect of death to it. It's called echad mishishim b'misa, 1/60th of death. So it doesn't mean that sleep is a bad thing. Okay, it's very important to sleep, and a person should know too. But in the Beis Hamikdash, in that place of no aging, no tiring, so it doesn't fit. In Maseches Midas, he says, it says that a kohen who falls asleep on his watch, so they have permission to burn his clothes. Right? Why burn his clothes? So Rav Wolfson says that clothes were the result of the Chet of Adam Harishon. Right? That was Vayedu Kerumim Heim, and they needed to have clothing. So if a kohen is sleeping in the Beis Hamikdash, that means he doesn't understand that this is supposed to be a place above and beyond and separated from Chet Adam Harishon, which brought this idea of sleeping into the world. That's why the clothing is something which is there. And he says, therefore, this is a theme throughout Yom Noraim, throughout the days of Slichas that we're approaching. Now, again, right, he talks about Slichas, the tefillas in his Beis Medrash, world famous for being very intense, very long. And he talks about the power, therefore, of getting up early for Slichas, as was done in the old days. You would have the Veker who would come, Shteyov, get up, for Slichas in the dark. And he said that's a sign of this rebellion against the sleepiness, against the habitual, that you come, with the enthusiasm early in the morning to come and to say the Slichas, right? The Sfarim, one of the opening piyutim, Ben Adam Malachan Nirdam, right? Kum Kara Elokecha, right? Why are you sleeping? Get out and call to Hashem, or Kum Kara B'Tachnonim. So he says that is now also the Talmud Yerushalmi talks about the idea of not sleeping on Rosh Hashana. Again, right? This is something that has to be taken, and there are different definitions of it. I was told that according to the Arizal, the Ikar is not sleeping in the morning, meaning getting up even early, Avodas Shachar, but then you could sleep. Anyway, the Sfarim say that certainly it's better to sleep than to be battling your time and gossiping or anything like that. And if a person needs, right, for the strength of their davening and the learning and the mitzvahs and their bein adam l'chavero, right, so then a person also can take a sleep, not for wallowing in it, but for recharging and doing. But he says this is the theme. Rosh Hashanah is the time of his chadshus, of connecting to the beginning. And as we began, there wasn't tiredness. There wasn't a sense of oldness. There wasn't getting jaded. There wasn't getting bored. All of that wasn't to be there, and this is what we're supposed to wake up. So now let's go back to Bikurim. Ra te'eno shebikra. So Wolfson describes it very poetically. He said, all the fruits are sleeping still. Right? In other words, they're unripe. After the long sleep of the winter, the tree woke up. There are fruits on there, but they're unripe. One fig woke up. He sees this first ripe fig. That fig should be brought to the Beis Hamikdash. That fig has in it that aspect of not sleeping, of awakening, of newness. And therefore, that has to be brought to the Beis Hamikdash, to the place of that renewal. So Rosh Hashanah is where we go back to that very beginning. And when you go back to that very beginning, everything is possible, right? The beginning, we tend to think that something that happened in time disappeared and therefore is gone, especially if something happened that seems to sour it. But we know that's not true. For example, the first Matan Torah was on, right, Shavuos, and afterwards came the Chet HaEgel. The luchos that we got on that first Matan Torah were broken. We received the second luchos on Yom Kippur, but we still celebrate Matan Torah on Shavuos. Why? Wasn't it over? Wasn't it ruined? Wasn't it spoiled? No, that still remained. What happened there was still real and still valuable. So even though Adam Harishon did a chet on the first day of his creation, the moment of his creation was one beyond death, beyond oldness, beyond tiredness, beyond boringness. And that is where we try to go on Rosh Hashanah. We're able to go there because, as he said, the Beis Hamikdash comes to us. This explains a very fascinating Gemara that Yisrael Salanter said we should really pay attention to in a famous letter to his Talmidim. I'll try to run it through quickly. The Gemara in Maseches Rosh Hashanah talks about what kind of horn do we blow or not blow on Rosh Hashanah. They come to the conclusion that you cannot blow the keren of a shor. You cannot blow the horn of an ox. A variety of reasons why not. One might be because of the construction of it. One might be whether it's called actually a shofar or not. But you also find there the principle, en kategor nase sanegor. The prosecutor cannot be a defender. So therefore, right, we don't want cows brought into the picture at all because of Chet HaEgel, which was a calf. The Gemara doesn't take that lying down. Says, okay, but if that's, what's the source for it? So the source is that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, when he goes in to the Kodesh Kodashim to atone for Am Yisrael, cannot wear his regular clothes which have gold in them. He has to wear the special white clothes that he wears on Yom Kippur. Ask the Gemara, wait a second, but the Kodesh Kodashim is full of gold, right? You have Nedar and Kodesh made of gold. There's lots of gold. They said, okay, but he didn't bring in the gold. But he brings in the coals in a gold machta, in a gold pan, right? He brings those in. The Gemara says he's not bringing those in to beautify himself. It's a functional thing. Okay, so the formula then for the problem of ein kategor nasis anegar seems to be that you're going into the Kodesh Kodashim with something that could be prosecuting you and you're beautifying yourself with it. What does that have to do with blowing shofar in Kansas City? Why can't you blow then the horn of a cow? So the Gemara says, shofar kivan delizikaron, since shofar comes from memory, kibifnim domi. It's as if it's inside the Kodesh Kodashim. Parenthetically, Tosfos just answers the loose thread, but it said the coin, it's only a problem if you're wearing the gold to beautify yourself. He says, when Am Yisrael blow the shofar, that beautifies them, right? So this is exactly what he's saying. We go into the Kodesh Kodashim, or as he explains it, the Kodesh Kodashim comes to us, right? And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says everyone has to prepare for themselves. Just as the Kohen Gadol goes in alone on Yom Kippur, the Kodesh Kodashim, so too each of us go into this interview with the Kadosh Baruch Hu alone. But aside from that kind of frightening Musar approach of it, it's the idea also is that we get to go back to the beginning. We get to go back to all beginnings. And the reason we're able to do this, he says, is because each of us has within inside of us a spark that was never damaged by the Chet Adam Harishon. All of us have that inside. And therefore, from that point, we can always renew, we can always rebuild. The Gemara points out that in the Korbanos of Rosh Hashanah, they use a different verb than other times. Usually you'll talk about bringing a korban, you'll say, V'hikravtem, bring your korban up close from Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah it says, Va'asisem, you make the korban. Say Chazal, that if you do Rosh Hashanah properly, Ma'ala ani alechem ki'ilu asisem es atzmechem. It's as if you made yourself. or as if you remade yourself, meaning that curse of time that seems to always just wear us down can be reversed, can be overcome. That's the koch that we have, and that's the koch of Rosh Hashanah. Right? Rav Hutner has a long piece in Rosh Hashanah about the relationship of Am Yisrael with time, and it's interesting that he explains that we're able to, on Rosh Hashanah, this idea of va'asisem, right? The Chazal say, "Mikivan shamadetem lefanei badin harei ki ilu baras yatzluchem hayom bria chadosha." When you stand before me on judgment on Rosh Hashanah, right? Again, people have such twisted pictures of Rosh Hashanah that it's when Hashem wants to get revenge on us, Hashem wants to hurt us, Hashem wants to settle accounts with us. Says Reb Chaim Friedlander, if that were true, it should be called Sof Hashanah. Right? The time to do that type of thing is on the last day of the year. What's on the first day of the year? He's judging us, but he's judging us in order to give us our new year. He's judging us in order to see how we can renew in this new year. Okay, so therefore, he says this very idea means that in the Kedushas Hayom of Rosh Hashanah, we have a certain obligation, right? That we have to try to free ourselves, he calls it, from the Ma'asa'o Shel Ha'etmol, from the burden of the past, which is Rovetz al Roshel Shel Adam Umeik Alav. It like sits on your head and causes you pain constantly. He says, if that's always there, you don't have place for ischadshus, for renewal. He says, therefore, he says, the idea of unloading that so that you can renew, that's tshuva. That's tshuva, is to separate yourself from that past and to be able to bring the powers of Kedusha into time, so that time, instead of becoming something that wears us down, is transformed by us into something that becomes a renewal. So this is what we find, and this is the idea of the shofar. The pasuk says, Ashrei ha'om yodei trua, Hashem ba'or panecha yahalechu. Oh, I forgot another beautiful gematria, Wolfson. It's interesting. Talmidim said he never sat there trying to think up gematrias. They would just jump out to him from the page. Right? He would just see the numbers of numerical value of things. He says, the shenim v'rananim yiyu, that pasuk we quoted from Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbos, that those who are planted in Beis Hashem, right, they will be the shenim, right, full of life and fresh. He says that equals Rosh Hashanah and equals Beis Hamikdash. Rosh Hashanah equals Beis Hamikdash. Both of them equal the shenim v'rananim yiyu. So Rosh Hashanah is all about refreshing, renewing, right, rejuvenating. That's what we're able to achieve and what we want to be able to achieve. Ashrei am yodei trua, we say, Chazal say, sheyodim lefatos is yitzram b'trua. It says that when Am Yisrael blow the shofar, HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes from kisei din to kisei rachamim. Now this expression, lefatos is yitzram, is hard to translate, because the only word they usually use in English to translate lefatot means to seduce, right? But which has poor connotations. But it means to draw close, to bring, to change the feelings of another. So how do we do it? So I saw David Cohen Shlita from Brooklyn, in one of his svarim. He wrote a very simple and very beautiful thing, the mashal. He said, imagine that a couple have been married for a long time, and as happens, you fall into habits and you complain to each other and all these things. Says, a husband who's smart comes up with an idea. He comes home one day, tells his wife, I have a babysitter, get dressed, we're going out. And he takes her to the place where they first met. And he tries to make everything the same as it was then, as much as he can. He may not be able to fit into a suit anymore, but whatever it is, you try to make as much as you can. That's very powerful. Why is that powerful? Because you go back to that point where it was new and where it was exciting and where you had dreams and ideas of what you wanted to build and do together and all these things. He says, so too, when we blow the shofar, Chazal say, it's the expression from our side of the creation of Adam, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas ruach chaim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu blew into Adam this spirit of life. And Chazal say, man de nafach, one who blows midilei nafach. You blow from within yourself. What is this spirit of life inside of us? That which Hashem blew into us. When we build a shofar, we go back to that moment when Hashem created Adam Rishon. And that was a time of tremendous love and tremendous racham. And we can always go back there, right? This is the idea of Karav Hashem l'chol Karav l'chol asher yikru be'emes, right? If we manage to cry out with emes, right, which is a major theme of Rosh Hashana, so then we can traverse all the barriers of time, all the barriers of what we were and what was, and all the different things, and everything can be new. Okay, it doesn't mean, by the way, I'll just put parenthetically, that a person shouldn't feel, well, okay, I did Naver on Aser Simei Tshuva, so obviously my Rosh Hashanah was a big fake and it didn't do anything. It's not true, right? Nobody expects that you're going to be perfect after Rosh Hashanah. There are these wonderful svarim that have been coming out by the many from this Reb Shlomo Hoffman. Reb Shlomo Hoffman was a fascinating person. He came from Hungary, and as a bacher, he learned in the Chevron Yeshiva, and they didn't have dorm space, particularly he slept in the house of this Villa Rebbe, and he was very, very close to Rabbi Isaac Sher, especially to the son-in-law of Alter Sobotka, and for his parnasa, he was a counselor in the Israeli prison system. Back then, in those days, you didn't need particular degrees. He saw an ad, would you like to be a counselor in the prison system? And he became one of the heads of counseling, and that helped him apply. He became a big expert in chinuch. He tells the following story. He says that he was walking in the hallway in the Chevron Yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva of Chatzkel Sarna saw him, and he said, Hoffman, why do you look like that? He says, what does Rosh Yeshiva mean? He said, you look all tense, you look all sad. He said, it's Aser Simei Tshuva. He says, who says you have to be sad and tense in Aser Simei Tshuva? He said, well, the Rambam says that until HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who's Yodea Talumus, who knows the depths, will testify that you're not going to go back and do that Avera again, you haven't done the full tshuva. So he said, Reb Chatzkel yelled at him. He says, why are you being machmer like the Rambam? He says, what? He says, we're maker like Rabbeinu Yonah. He says, that's our Masara from Yisrael Salata. What Rabbeinu Yonah? Rabbeinu Yonah says that the tshuva that you're doing is changing direction. You're not expected to perfect yourself in one Rosh Hashanah, one Aser Simei Tshuva, one Yom Kippur. He says the equivalent is if you went out driving, you wanted to drive to Bnei Brak, and you're driving, things don't look familiar, you pull into a gas station, saying, I'm near Bnei Brak? He says, no, you're near Beersheba. You went the wrong way. He says, when you pull out of the gas station and your car is now pointing to Bnei Brak, that's true. He says, that's true. There are going to be more wrong turns. There are going to be flat tires. But you've turned the direction. He said, that's what has to be done. So that is hischachus. That is new. When you're pointing in a new direction, even if there's a long way to go, that's an entirely new and different journey. And that means it's a different you. So this idea of Bikurim, we celebrate newness. We celebrate the ability to renew. We celebrate the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in his connection to us and in the Torah that he gave us, gives us the ability to be above time and not to let those things wear us down. And that's why we should be approaching Rosh Hashanah, yes, with the aim that it's something very serious, but it's especially serious because of the tremendous opportunity that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to give us that we can do and use if we do it right. Okay, a wonderful week. Okay.